Picture this. Derek shoved the door so hard the bell slammed twice against the frame. He stood there in that pressed jacket, pointing across the counter at Frank like he was calling out a stray dog. "You're not his father," Derek said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You're just some childless shopkeeper playing house with my boy. Stay away from him." Now you have to understand something about Frank Harlan. He owned Harlan's Tools in that small Indiana town, the same place his dad had run until the day he died. And here's the part nobody standing outside the big front window knew yet. That store was about to become the one place Derek could never force his way back into. The question is, what gave a man like Frank the quiet ground to stand on when everything around him tried to pull it away? Frank was 35, but the store had aged him in the way a lifetime of early mornings and late invoices will do. His dad had left it to him with one rule: just show up every day. Frank had kept that rule through the years after his own bad news from the doctor, through the day Rachel packed the last box and drove off, through every quiet evening when the close sign went up and the lights stayed on a little longer than they needed to. The shop smelled like oil and sawdust and the faint metal bite of new hardware, and Frank kept it that way because it was the only thing that still felt steady. Then one afternoon, a 6-year-old boy named Ethan started lingering by the paint aisle while his mother Nora worked 2 doors down at the diner. Frank set an old wooden stool behind the counter and let the boy sort screws into the right bins. He made Ethan a paper badge that said "Assistant" in crooked letters and pinned it to his shirt with a safety pin. Nora watched from the doorway the first few times, then started leaving him there a little longer each day. On a Wednesday, she found Frank restocking brushes and asked if he would stand in as Ethan's dad for the school's pancakes with dad breakfast. Frank told her he would only say yes if she told him the real reason. She said every other boy in the class had someone and Ethan didn't want to be the only one sitting alone. Frank closed the store that Friday morning, put on a clean shirt, and walked Ethan through the cafeteria doors. The other kids at the table were the ones who let it slip. They talked about how Ethan had been telling the class all year that his dad ran the tool store on Main Street, that his dad let him count the change and knew every size bolt by heart. Frank sat there with his paper plate of pancakes and realized the boy had chosen him months before Nora ever asked. Derek must have heard about it from someone who drove the 35 minutes into town that weekend. He came straight to the store the next morning, the way Frank had known he would eventually. After the loud words and the finger-pointing, Frank stayed behind the counter and spoke in the same steady voice he used when teaching Ethan the difference between a lag bolt and a carriage bolt. "For years," Frank said. "That's how long it's been since you drove that road to see him. I can count the mornings he waited by the window." Derek stood there a moment longer, the jacket suddenly looking too tight across his shoulders, then turned and left without another word. He never came back. That night Nora showed up on Frank's porch after Ethan was asleep, her hands shaking while she tried to explain how scared she was that she had set her son up to lose one more person. Frank didn't promise anything except what he knew he could keep. The store door would be open at 7 every morning, same as always. Ethan kept coming. Frank kept the stool ready. And somewhere in those afternoons, the boy started calling him by a name that stuck even when no one else was around. You have to understand how those afternoons worked. Frank would flip the sign on the door to "back in 5, and Ethan would perch on that stool, legs swinging, while the boy learned to read a thread gauge the way other kids learned their times tables. One afternoon, Frank pulled the old brass caliper from the drawer under the register, the one with the faint F. Harlan 1978 scratched along the beam, and let Ethan practice measuring the head of a carriage bolt without scratching the finish. The boy held it like it was made of glass. "Don't squeeze too hard," Frank told him. "It'll tell you the truth if you let it." That was the same week the letter came. Plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from the city. Frank set it on the counter without opening it. He already knew what it said. Derek's firm had started making quiet calls to the suppliers, asking whether Frank's little shop on Main was even worth keeping on the books now that the big box chain had opened 20 miles out. The letter was their polite way of raising the wholesale prices on the very bolts Ethan was learning to name. Frank didn't mention it to Nora when she came by to pick up her son. He just handed Ethan the paper sack of leftover hardware the boy liked to sort at the kitchen table. But the next morning, when Frank turned the key in the lock, he found Derek waiting on the sidewalk again. This time with a folder under one arm and a watch that caught the light every time he checked it. Derek didn't raise his voice this time. He simply laid the folder on the counter and said the numbers out loud. Lease numbers, supplier numbers, the kind of figures that made the store sound already half sold. "You're 63, Frank. Time to think about what you're leaving behind." Frank kept his hands on the counter, palms flat, and didn't answer. Ethan was due in 40 minutes. The stool was already pulled out. The mini-crisis came 2 days later, right at closing. Ethan arrived early, backpack still on, because Nora had called ahead to say the boy had been sent home for talking back to a substitute teacher. Frank listened without interrupting, then set a small box of mismatched nuts and bolts in front of him. "Count these by size," he said quietly. "Start with the half-inch." Ethan worked in silence for a while, the brass caliper clicking softly. Then the phone rang. It was the school. The principal wanted to know why Ethan had told his classmates his father owned the hardware store and could fix anything. Frank kept his voice even. "Because he does," he said and hung up. He looked at the boy still bent over the box. The caliper lay open beside Ethan's hand, its jaws measuring a carriage bolt that was just a hair under spec. Frank didn't correct the measurement. He let it stand. That evening, after Ethan had gone, Frank finally opened the white envelope. Inside was a single page, the old company letterhead still visible under the new logo Derek's firm had stamped across the top. It listed the patent numbers for the thread gauge design Frank had filed in '78, the one the suppliers now sold under another name. At the bottom, someone had written in Derek's tidy script, "We can settle this quietly." Frank folded the letter once, then again, and slipped it into the same drawer that held the caliper. He didn't lock it. The next afternoon, when Ethan climbed onto the stool, Frank asked if he remembered how to read the gauge on the caliper without looking at the numbers. The boy nodded. Outside, the street was quiet except for the sound of a single car turning the corner and slowing as it passed the store. Frank didn't look up. He just set another bolt on the counter and waited to see what the boy would measure first. Frank watched the boy's fingers move across the bolt, slow and careful. The way someone learns to trust their own hands after years of watching someone else do the same job. Ethan didn't rush. He set the caliper's jaw against the threads, adjusted until it sat true, then called out the reading without glancing at the markings. 17 1/4. Frank nodded once. Good enough for now. The bell above the door rang. A man in a pressed overcoat stepped inside, shaking rain from his shoulders. He carried a slim folder under one arm and introduced himself as one of Derek's associates. Said his name was Paul. Said he'd come to collect some paperwork Frank might have overlooked. Frank kept his palms flat on the counter, the way he had 2 days earlier, and asked what kind of paperwork. Paul opened the folder and laid out 3 sheets. One was a copy of the old patent. Another showed the current supplier agreement under Derek's firm. The third listed a settlement figure, $32,000, if Frank signed away any claim to the thread gauge and kept the hardware store out of it. Ethan stayed on the stool, the caliper still in his hand. Paul glanced at the boy, then back at Frank. "We can keep this between us. No need to drag a child into business matters." Frank didn't answer right away. He reached under the counter and pulled out the same white envelope from the night before. He slid it across the wood beside the new papers. "You tell Derek the numbers on that letterhead are mine. Always were." His voice stayed even, the same tone he used when he told a customer a part was out of stock. Paul picked up the envelope, read the single line Derek had written, and tucked it back into his folder. "He figured you might say that. The offer stands for 48 hours. He left without another word, the bell ringing behind him. Ethan looked up. Was that about the store? Frank set another bolt on the counter. It's about a promise somebody made a long time ago. You want to measure this one next." The boy nodded and went back to work, the caliper clicking again. Frank watched the street through the front window. The same car that had passed the day before rolled by once more, slower this time. He recognized the driver now. Another man from Derek's office, the one who always wore the navy suit and kept his hands in his pockets when he talked. That night, after Ethan had gone home with Nora, Frank sat at the kitchen table with the caliper in front of him. He turned it over, felt the worn brass where his own thumb had rested for decades. The patent numbers were etched on the back in tiny script, the same ones listed in the letter. He hadn't shown them to anyone since the day he filed the paperwork in '78. Derek's firm had stamped over the original company name, but the numbers didn't change. Frank folded a clean paper napkin around the caliper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't lock the drawer. The next morning brought the new mini-crisis. The school called again, this time at 9 sharp. The principal said Ethan had drawn the hardware store on his worksheet and labeled it, "My Dad's Place." They wanted Frank to come in for a meeting. Frank told them he'd be there after closing. He hung up, then dialed the number on the letterhead from Paul's folder. A receptionist answered. Frank gave his name and asked for Derek. When the line clicked over, he said only one thing: "Come by the store tomorrow at 6. Bring the original agreement, not the stamped copy." He set the receiver down before Derek could answer. Outside, the morning light hit the display window and caught the brass edges of the caliper where it sat on the counter. Frank left it there. He didn't cover it. When Ethan arrived after school, the boy spotted it right away and asked if he could practice again. Frank said yes. He set a new bolt beside it and waited to see whether the boy would reach for the caliper first or ask what the phone call had been about. Either way, the measurement would come next. Frank didn't rush the boy. He let Ethan pick up the caliper on his own, the way a man learns anything worth keeping. The brass felt cool under the kid's fingers, and Frank watched the way those small hands lined it up with the bolt threads, slow and careful like he'd been shown. No chatter from either of them, just the soft click of the adjustment screw and the afternoon light sliding across the counter. That caliper had measured 1,000 pieces before Ethan was born, back when Frank's name was still on the shop drawings and the patent sat in a tin box under the bed. The school meeting came at 4:30. Frank walked in wearing the same jacket he'd worn to work, the napkin-wrapped caliper still tucked in the inside pocket, because he hadn't wanted to leave it out with the store empty. The principal sat behind a desk that looked too big for the room, papers already stacked in front of her like evidence. She said Ethan's drawing had raised questions about stability at home, about whether a hardware store was the right influence for a boy his age. Frank listened without interrupting. When she asked if he had any formal education beyond the trade, he answered that he'd filed his first patent the year she was born and left it at that. She blinked, wrote something down, and the meeting ended with a handshake that felt more like a truce than an agreement. Outside, the same navy suit from Derek's office stood leaning against a lamppost across the street, hands still in his pockets. Frank nodded once in his direction, then kept walking. No point in pretending he hadn't seen. Back at the store, the phone rang at 5:40. Derek's voice came through the receiver smoother than it had the day before. He said traffic was light and he'd be there in 10 minutes with the papers Frank had asked for. Frank told him the door would be unlocked. He hung up, set 2 chairs at the counter, and placed the caliper between them where the light would catch the etched numbers. He didn't cover it with the napkin this time. Ethan sat on a stool near the register, legs swinging, waiting to see what happened next. Frank poured 2 glasses of water from the old cooler in the back and set one beside each chair. Then he pulled the original letter from Paul's folder and laid it flat so the date showed plain. 1978. The year the design was his before any firm stamped a new name over the top. Derek arrived exactly on time, the agreement in a leather folio under one arm. He looked at the caliper first, then at Frank, then at the boy who hadn't moved from his stool. The navy suit stayed outside, visible through the front window, pacing now. Derek set the folio on the counter but didn't open it right away. Frank asked if he remembered the name that used to sit under the patent number before the stamp. Derek's shoulders tightened under the pressed shirt. He said the firm had acquired the rights fairly. Frank didn't argue the point. Instead, he reached into his jacket, unwrapped the caliper from the napkin, and turned it so the numbers faced Derek under the overhead bulb. The brass caught the light clean, no shine left, just the deep marks from 40 years of use. Derek looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he asked, quiet, whether Frank had kept the original drawings. Frank said the drawings were safe, the same place they'd always been, and that Ethan had already learned how to read the first page. The boy sat straighter on the stool but didn't speak. Derek's eyes moved from the caliper to the letter, then back again. He opened the folio at last and slid the stamped copy across the counter without being asked. The new mini-crisis arrived in the form of a second call from the school, this one to Frank's cell while Derek still sat across from him. The principal wanted confirmation that Ethan would not be returning to the store after hours anymore. Something about liability and after-school care. Frank told her he'd handle it and ended the call. Derek watched the whole exchange without comment. Frank folded the stamped copy once, placed it beside the caliper, and waited for Derek to decide what came next. Frank looked at the stamped copy lying there on the counter, then at the caliper still resting on its napkin. The numbers caught the light again, plain as the day they were stamped. Now you have to understand something about that caliper. It wasn't just a tool Frank kept for old times. It was the one he'd used on the first prototype, the one he carried in his pocket through every shop he ever opened. Derek reached over and touched the edge of the napkin without picking anything up. His voice stayed low when he asked if Ethan knew whose name had really been on those drawings before the firm stepped in. Frank didn't answer right away. He folded the napkin back around the caliper, slow and deliberate, like he was tucking away something that had already been disturbed enough. The boy on the stool watched every move. Outside, the navy suit had stopped pacing and was checking his watch through the glass. Then the second call came through, this time from Nora. She'd heard from the principal and wanted to know why Ethan was still spending his afternoons at the store instead of the after-school program she'd paid for. Frank kept his voice steady on the line, told her the boy was safe, told her he'd sort it out by morning. When he hung up, the shop felt smaller somehow. Derek sat back on the stool beside Ethan, but the moment had shifted again. The new tension settled in like a draft under the door. Derek said the firm had been looking into the old patent again after the last letter arrived, the one Frank had mailed 6 weeks earlier with the original drawings attached. He admitted the numbers on the caliper matched the ones in the archive, the ones nobody at the firm had expected to surface after all these years. Ethan shifted on his stool but kept quiet, the way Frank had taught him when grown men were doing the talking. Frank placed the folded stamped copy next to the wrapped caliper again. He asked Derek, plain as anything, what the firm intended to do now that the original pages were out of storage. Derek looked at the napkin once more, at the way the cloth still held the shape of the tool after all those decades. He said the legal team would need time, but the pacing outside the window told a different story. The navy suit was on his phone now, glancing inside every few seconds. Frank stood and walked to the back counter where the rotary sat. He dialed the school himself this time, left a message for the principal that Ethan would be staying with family through the end of the week and that any liability questions could wait until the drawings were settled. When he turned back, Derek was holding the caliper again, still wrapped, turning it under the light like he was checking the date for himself. The boy watched, quiet. And here's the part that kept the room still. Derek asked if Frank remembered the apprenticeship program the firm had shut down in '79, the one that had carried Frank's name before the paperwork changed. Frank didn't confirm or deny it. He just nodded toward the letter still on the counter and said the answer had been sitting there the whole time Ethan learned to read the first page. The navy suit knocked once on the glass. Derek didn't move to open the door. Frank stayed by the counter, one hand resting on the old rotary as if it might ring again. You could feel the quiet stretch out, the way it does when two men have said all the polite words and the truth is still sitting there between them. Derek set the caliper down gentle, the cloth still folded around it like somebody's Sunday shirt. He cleared his throat once, then spoke low enough that only Frank and the boy could hear. "I told them the drawings looked familiar the first time they came across my desk," Derek said. "They told me to file them under closed cases. 40 years of your notes, Frank, and they called it obsolete." He looked at Ethan, then back. "I should have pushed harder. That was my mistake." Frank didn't answer right away. He just watched the navy suit pace on the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear. "The firm's meeting is set for tomorrow morning," Derek went on. 9 o'clock in the main conference room. "They want the original pages and the caliper both. If you'll come, I'll make sure every name on the letter you mailed gets read out loud." Frank nodded once. "Ethan stays with me till this is finished." "Of course," Derek said. He reached into his coat and laid a small card on the counter. No fancy printing, just a name and a number written by hand. "That's my direct line. Call it any time tonight if you change your mind." The navy suit knocked again, louder. Derek finally opened the door, but he didn't step through right away. He turned back. "I'm sorry, Frank, for the way it was handled back then and for the way it was handled now." Then he left, the bell over the door giving one tired chime. Frank locked up early. He and Ethan ate cold sandwiches at the counter while the streetlights came on. The boy asked if they were still going to fix the neighbor's gate tomorrow. Frank said yes, then told him to pack a clean shirt because they might be downtown longer than expected. The caliper stayed on the counter all night, still wrapped, the stamped copy tucked beside it. At 9 the next morning, they walked into the firm's old brick building on Maple. The conference room held maybe a dozen people, lawyers in dark suits, 2 board members Frank recognized from the old apprenticeship days, and the man who had once signed the letter shutting the program down. Derek stood at the head of the table, the caliper and the drawings already laid out on the polished wood. Every eye followed Frank as he took the chair at the far end, Ethan quiet at his side. Derek began by reading the dates on the original patent pages out loud. Then he passed the caliper around so each person could see the markings. The numbers matched the archive exactly. One of the board members cleared his throat and asked how they had missed it for so long. Derek answered that the paperwork had been moved to storage after Frank left, and nobody had thought to check the apprentice signature until the new inquiry arrived 6 weeks earlier. Frank spoke only when asked. He explained the measurements he had drawn in 1978, the same ones still stamped on the tool. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. When the question slowed, Derek looked around the table and said, "Frank built the first working model on his own time after hours because the firm wouldn't pay for the prototype. We used his design for 30 years and never paid him a cent beyond the apprentice wage." The room stayed quiet. The man who had signed the shutdown letter folded his hands on the table. "We owe you an apology, Frank, publicly and on the record. The firm will settle the patent claim at the figure your letter suggested, plus back royalties. And we're reopening the apprenticeship under its original name, your name." Derek turned toward Frank. "I should have said it yesterday, but I'll say it here where they can all hear. I'm sorry for the years it took. I'm sorry we made you carry that alone." Frank looked at each face once, then at the caliper resting in the center of the table. "Keep the tool," he said. "It belongs in the shop where the boys can see what a proper measurement looks like." They left the building by 10:30, the signed agreement in Frank's pocket. Ethan walked beside him carrying the empty cloth the caliper had been wrapped in. On the way home, they stopped at the corner store for 2 bottles of cream soda, the kind Frank used to buy after long shifts. They sat on the front steps and drank them slow, the afternoon sun warm on the concrete. A week later, the local paper ran a short piece about the settlement and the reopened program. Frank clipped it and tucked it into the same drawer where the old napkin still lived, pressed flat. Ethan started staying after school 2 afternoons a week, learning the lathe the way Frank had learned it. The boy's first finished piece was a small brass gauge, stamped with the date and the letters FA in the corner. Frank kept the gate fixed for the neighbor, same as always. Some evenings he would stand at the counter and turn the cream soda bottle in his hands, listening to the quiet the way a man does when the work is finally finished and the people he loves are still close by. That, he told himself, was payment enough.